جوتشكار وكاركر جندي ورينجبر حمو برولتر قلي قليستان شورش وفولكان تبدنا ميتن آقر وبيتن صورن وكئيتون آقر قهاقتسون قاضا بتقن دنيا دحجي أو بيت وآقر هي دجمن دكوجي كينان هي كينان كينان.
Thump, 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 thump. We scampered our way through the eerie late-night fog, keeping our eyes on the equal to or greater than 6 riot gear-clad police officers running in front of us. Strange rhythmic taps pierced the air over the unfiltered anger of the growing crowd in the distance. Both sounds grew louder each time I put down one foot in front of the other. Close to midnight, the young woman who had offered me a ride back to my lodgings from the Ferguson Police Department had instead parked behind a common sedan on the residential side street of the Shaw neighborhood, St. Louis, on October 11, 2014. Parking there had been my suggestion, after we decided to join the latest spontaneous protest as part of the national convergence of Ferguson October instead of heading home. The car in front of us seemed to be local, and I assumed they knew what they were doing. At this time of night, this close to where it was all happening, they had to be going to the same place we were, and we would follow them. The dark, nondescript nature of the sedan in front of us gave no indication that it was actually a clown car of already suited up and battle-ready riot policemen. As my companion put the car in park, they seemed to pour out endlessly, at least 6, but probably more. They were definitely going where we were. Now we were running behind them, keeping a not overly suspicious following distance and growing nearer and nearer to the rainbow-colored rings that shine through the fog and mark the spotlights, streetlights, headlights, and various other lights that were pointed on the demonstrators. The rhythms grew louder, distinct from the continuous drumming done by various protesters earlier throughout the weekend. Thump, thump, thump. The sound assaulted my senses, sending the butterflies soaring in my stomach. As we grew closer, my eyes revealed that fear was not brought upon me by accident. The police, lined up in an expansive riot line, were tapping their batons on the ground and on their shields, aiming to intimidate. Once again, they had killed another black youth in the St. Louis area, Von Derritt Myers Jr., a couple of days before the world converged on their city in outrage at a previous police killing, the one that reawakened everything, of Michael Brown Jr. And once again, since Mike Brown's death August 9th and Von Derritt's on October 8th, the streets were ours, but the police were letting us know that they would be fiercely contested. Their expression of force was magnified to me as I arrived on our side of the riot line, as a mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle we naively called a tank chose the same moment to show up. The mix of fear and determination and anger and solidarity I felt in that moment, when the lines between us and them were clear, would change my life forever. Between the palpable anger and sheer numbers on our side, and the fierce armor and impersonal, duty-driven facial expressions on theirs, I felt like my running feet had carried me into a war zone. I had no idea that at that moment, some 6,000 miles away, a fierce battle in an actual war zone was unfolding that would also change the course of my life. On the Syrian side of the Turkey-Syrian border, in the predominantly Kurdish town of Kobanê, everyday civilians, formed into motley defense forces, were entering the second week of a life-or-death struggle with the Islamic State. Much of the world's eyes turned there around that time, but I remained blind, as I was caught up in a single-issue world then. Across the border, in Istanbul, there were also throngs of young people driven into the streets by righteous anger and stubborn hope. As in St. Louis, on that October night, inspired footsteps carried tired bodies through the streets of the Turkish capital toward rigid police riot lines, backed up by formidable armored vehicles. A bright light from above scoured the streets all around the young demonstrators, sweeping through them in short but regular intervals. Despite the endless deliberations in each of their heads, no one could tune out the steady whir coming from the helicopters. Kurds and their supporters were holding the Turkish state's feet to the fire, outraged at the sight of Turkish tanks, actual ones, propped up on a hill overlooking Kobanê, while their operators sat inside doing nothing. As the St. Louis police dumped canisters of pepper spray at sitting demonstrators that night, Turkish police and soldiers launched speeding bullets, not at the Islamic State, but at Kurdish youth who refused to stand by as their family and friends across the border faced slaughter at the hands of ISIS fighters. Somewhat more insulated from pressure from the international press, the Turkish police killed dozens of people during that time, and along the border guards doused Kurdish civilians with tear gas in an effort to prevent people leaving Turkey to go fight against ISIS. The state saw Kobanê as a problem city and was deathly afraid that people from within their borders might build common cause with the city's people. After all, Kobané's Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, and Armenians were the architects of a revolution that gripped the hearts of millions worldwide, but most especially those of Kurds under Turkish rule. Turkey was happy that the light of the Rojava Revolution, Kobanê, seemed to be flickering under ISIS's suffocating advance. They could hardly conceal their glee at the prospects of new, more ideologically aligned neighbors across the way. And that was how it looked on October 11th through 12th, at the same time I was marching through the streets of St. Louis. ISIS had already taken half of the city, and the capture of Kobanê would have left only two highly isolated Rojava strongholds standing, and may very well have meant the end of the last regional force capable of fighting the Islamic State. Instead, thanks to a combination of the heroic resistance of the locals from Kobanê, as well as Kurds, Turkish leftists, a handful of other internationalists who illegally crossed borders from as far-flung as Europe and as close as Turkish and Iranian Kurdistan, and airstrikes from the global coalition, Kobanê was liberated in March 2015. The intensity of the fight against ISIS fascism and the revolution in Kurdistan for radical democracy, women's liberation, cultural renaissance, pluralism, and ecology dramatically increased thereafter and have not stopped since. The Black Lives Matter movement has grown, matured, waned, and resurged since that October night back in 2014, and I was a small part of a wave of protests in Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri that did not see a protest-free day for 400 days straight. Both of these moments in history, separated by thousands of miles, but so similar in the mindset and yearnings for freedom that drive them, built upon long traditions of sacrifice, revolt, and care of the Kurdish and African American people respectively, and neither moment will be the end of their journeys for liberation. Both the Black Freedom Movement and Kurdish Freedom Movement have played a crucial role in developing my own consciousness of what a better world could look like. And I think that these two movements have a lot of similar history, desires, ideas, and manifestations of these ideas, and that both have a lot to teach each other and the rest of the world about what it means to live and to fight. To the extent they have actually converged in recent years, I urge them to converge further and take even greater steps to strengthen their bonds of international solidarity. Both movements have had to grapple with the failures of the old Soviet model of socialism, the discrediting of the state, and the problems that arise from centralization. I see both movements as continually progressing towards similar ideas at about the same time. The importance of securing autonomy and self-sufficiency for their people while trying to make the ruling powers obsolete, the need for cooperative economies controlled by local communities, a foremost focus on women's freedom and autonomous women's organizations, their building of cross-cultural coalitions with other resistant people, and the shift from glorification of workerism to an ecologically oriented future. Both have emerged into the 21st century with more decentralized and grassroots democratic struggles, and it is these trends that I want to trace. For the rest of this series, I will weave back and forth between Kurds and Black Americans, who they are, how their movement started, influential organizations, repression they've faced, autonomous structures, women's movement, changes in ideology, and current influences. I will conclude by pinpointing where they have crossed over, and calling for that crossover to deepen. Kurds in the Middle East are indigenous to that region and are a distinct ethnic group, although with variation in culture across the areas in which they live. They are split between 4 arbitrary nation-states: Turkey, known as Bakur, Syria, Rojava, Iraq, Bashur, and Iran, Rojalat, and number around 30 million. They are commonly called the largest ethnic group without their own state, but their political freedom movements are split between those that desire a separate state and those that see states as antithetical to freedom and instead desire autonomy and non-state democracy. It is unclear how long they have been conscious of themselves with a distinct national identity, but state erasure of their shared cultural practices, including banning their languages, songs, dances, clothing, flags, etc., has forced them to organize politically around Kurdish identity or risk annihilation and complete assimilation. Kurds were not wholesale subjected to slavery, but usually kept entirely dependent on the states in places like Syria, where they weren't allowed to grow fruit trees and could only grow wheat for the market. In Iran, they were forced into the most menial and exploitative jobs, including kolbars, people who carry unbelievably heavy loads of goods on their backs through mountainous paths to and from the border. They see themselves as the biggest international colony in the Middle East. As far as I know, Kurds typically weren't explicitly banned from being in certain public spaces in the 4 parts of Kurdistan, as long as they only presented themselves as Turks in Turkey, Syrians in Syria, etc. In school, they learned only about the nation-state's preferred culture and not their own. It wasn't their looks that barred them from acceptance in the eyes of nation-states, but the independent character of their culture and history. The Kurdish people had long been insistent on carving their own path, anathema to the dominant ideologies of the states that claimed rulership over the lands where Kurds have always lived. All 4 states wanted what Turkey expressly declared in their 1934 Law on Resettlement: a country with one language, one mentality, and unity of feelings. The danger of such a project lies in what is not stated, but implied. All other ways of being that don't serve the state have to be paved over at any cost. In all 4 states, Kurds have been subjected to ethnic cleansing and forced removals and relocations. I asked a Syrian Kurdish friend of mine to write up his story of what it was like to be deprived of his mother tongue in his own homeland. The following are his words. During my childhood, I was raised in a village environment where we lived a simple, normal life. At the beginning of our admission to primary school, the Arabic language was imposed on us through the policy of the Ba'ath regime. The Ba'ath regime carefully planned to assimilate the Kurdish people and make them forget their language. In order to achieve its goal, it brought Arab teachers from the Syrian coast and deployed them to schools in the Kurdish regions. Not only did the security and intelligence system impose on the Kurdish people assimilation to the Arabic language, the villagers also had to provide housing and food for these teachers. Learning a new language is really good, but being forced to forget your own language is very cruel. We spent the primary level in the village, but in order to continue studying in the preparatory and secondary levels, we had to go to the city. There, the school administration and the teachers dealt very differently. They became more cruel and were very violent with us if we made a mistake or broke orders, as we were in a military barracks. There, during the preparatory stage, I got to know the Kurdistan Liberation Movement. It was secretly active amongst the youth to spread awareness about the Kurdish identity and the need to not allow anyone to take it from us. The movement began with awareness raising through publications and secret meetings. Several of us, from 5 to 7 people, used to meet and discuss our identity and the need to preserve it. We began with the Kurdish language. I used to gather at home with 3 of my friends, and one of the comrades in charge taught us the Kurdish alphabet once a week. We were very careful in our meetings. We did not dare reveal what we were doing to anyone for fear of the fascist regime. For us, the start was very interesting. For the first time, we could learn, read, and write our mother tongue. After that, we advanced a stage, exchanging scrapbooks and some stories written in Kurdish. The first booklet that fell into my hands was made up of several pages for teaching the Kurdish language. Because I was so excited about it and because I wanted to keep a copy of it myself, and due to the difficulty of printing it, I copied it and wrote it by hand in my own notebook. I kept it for a long time. Because of the great pressure on the Kurdish people and the systematic assimilation policies practiced by the Ba'athist regime in Syria, we were not able to develop ourselves much in our mother tongue. Our learning was limited to only reading and writing. Although the Kurdish language developed a lot abroad, Europe in particular, where many Kurdish writers took refuge to escape fascist and repressive regimes in the four parts of Kurdistan, after the Rojava Revolution, the door was opened widely to us. We were finally able to build an integrated educational system in our mother tongue to teach our children what we were deprived of during our childhood. My friend's story is the story of countless other Kurds. Whenever states so vehemently deny the existence of a people, that people will inevitably wrestle with their identity, searching for meaning that will allow them to survive those denial policies and come out stronger and more united. They will find the words on their lips. Who are we? Kîne.
Kîne.
African Americans come from many African countries and were forcibly taken from the land they are indigenous to and transported to the New World as slaves. In 1619, the first Africans were brought on ships to the New World against their will. There is serious debate as to the status of these first Africans, and some recent scholarship argues that they were not originally slaves in the way we think of them today, but indentured servants who had set terms of servitude, though still brutal and against their will. These scholars are not implying that Africans weren't brutally and forcibly taken from their lands to provide labor under European masters, but that African slavery in what would come to be called America was not set in stone as a guaranteed facet, just as the racial categories and labels that seem so far-reaching today would have been largely meaningless prior to the colonization of the Americas. Regardless of whether the first Africans on the continent were seen as slaves or indentured servants, it is known that there were not yet laws that categorized people into racial categories on the books, and not any that defined slave or free either. Unfree Africans were there mainly among other unfree indentured servants and working-class laborers from many European countries, as well as indigenous peoples from many different tribes. All these groups were treated horrendously by the small sector of European colonialist ruling classes. However, in competition, the ideologies of these ruling classes may have been. And it was not until later that the specific and harsher laws came into existence targeting Africans. It is known that some Africans served out terms of indenture and were free in the early days of colonization, but that began to change within 20 years. Combinations of oppressed Africans, Europeans, and natives rebelled against their conditions, and many of the first laws designating the categories of whites and blacks were passed specifically in response to this interracial mingling and rebellion. Colonial power holders used a carrot and stick strategy to divide Europeans and Africans who otherwise might, and sometimes did, band together against their rule. It is in this context that, quote, blacks and all their subsequent generations of offspring were made into slaves for life, while, quote, whites could leave servitude after a set amount of years and their children were born free. Slavery was officially codified into law on the heels of Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when multi-ethnic groups of rebels, many of them servants and slaves finding an escape in the militia, attacked elite institutions and politicians. Unfortunately, this rebellion's pretext came from anti-indigenous sentiment. Nonetheless, the colonial powers saw the rebellion as a dire threat and imposed sweeping laws aimed at convincing or forcing poor Europeans to identify themselves with their rulers based on the skin color rather than with the African and native populations who were oppressed by the same people as they were. Despite these efforts, many Africans escaped from slavery and joined up with native bands hiding out in swamps or other hard-to-reach places, forming maroon colonies that became incubators for many of the traditions that make up what is considered American black culture today. Unfortunately, only a minority of early Africans in the colonies were able to escape to freedom. Since the early 1600s, descendants of these various African peoples have been specifically trying to construct a national identity in an area that they had no choice but to go, and under states that saw them as property originally. Displacement from the land, which served as the backdrop for their various creation myths, stories, foods, and medicines, as well as the breakup of community structures, led to loss of their culture, which was further decimated through suppression of traditional spiritual beliefs and languages, as well as the prohibition on any form of education or literacy whatsoever. African-descended people were never citizens of the United States until the passing of the 14th Amendment, after the forcible abolition of slavery as a military strategy by Lincoln to win the Civil War. As new citizens, they continued to be denied the full rights of citizenship in practice through Jim Crow practices until the 1960s, and always these limits to the rights of citizenship were hung onto by the ruling powers in whatever form they could get away with. Because the 13th Amendment banning slavery made an exception if it was as punishment for a crime, we can trace unpaid black labor and exploitation through convict leasing to legal Jim Crow, and now to the new Jim Crow, as brilliantly expressed in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. Today, black people are overcriminalized and put into prisons at much higher rates than the rest of the population. Prisoners are threatened with psychological torture and punishment if they refuse to work for free or minuscule wages. And then felons are often banned from doing most of the things that black people under the height of Jim Crow were also banned from, including the rights to vote, to own a firearm, public assistance, to leave the country, parental rights, among others. Felons can be legally discriminated against in looking for jobs or securing housing. In this way, the same cheap and free labor system, as well as the oppressed status of black people, has transformed but never been fully abolished.
شیاربون ربن پریشان به هفر رابون ای هوال روبسون دن بیهی جیهان کار کرو رنج بر جوتار شیاربون ربن پریشان به هفر رابون ای هوال روبسون.
The cold drizzle stung my unprepared face as I descended from the megabus after a wild 15-hour bus ride from Dallas. The bleak early October weather in St. Louis had no plans to give me a warm welcome. And as I would soon find out, neither did the city. The day earlier, I had purchased a bus ticket from my college dorm room on a whim, told my parents I was going to a city that had been sensationalized and demonized on cable news nightly for 2 months, and built an unmatched camaraderie with my fellow bus riders as we pondered the meaning of the universe the entire trip, punctuated by periods of tense waiting as police pulled out all of our bags at stops and sent their dogs a-sniffin'. 2 of our compatriots, a name so earned because we were all sharing in the mega misery together, were arrested in Memphis with small amounts of marijuana in their bags. Growing up in a relatively sheltered, predominantly white and middle-class suburb like I did, I was shocked by the way our large express bus was treated like a federal prison transfer bus each time it arrived in a new city. But the passengers with me were almost entirely working class and probably 80% black, and for the rest of the trip, my naive mind would be forced to confront that the rules were completely different from where I grew up. Minus the aforementioned 2, we all arrived in St. Louis intact, and one by one we scurried head down to another one of the city's signature red brick walls. The wall was protected from the biting rain by something like a carport, and to the disembarking passengers, to be huddled together under there seemed so heavenly in comparison to the cold that none of us noted we weren't actually at a bus station at all. Within seconds of us finding some comfort, an irritable man came out of the adjacent door barking at us about how this was a private business, not a bus stop, and we needed to go wait somewhere else. We filtered away towards the gas station to the left of us, on the corner of Clark Avenue and South Jefferson. I was sticking to my newfound buddy Cedric, a towering, slender black man in his late 20s, who was carrying with him a childlike giddiness at being back in his hometown for the first time in years. Also with us was Rodney, a stubby man in his early 40s, also black, fitted with cornrows under his Cardinals cap and wearing an outsized smile for his body, who had showed himself as a mystic the whole bus ride, setting off conversation upon conversation about spirituality and the inner workings of the mind. Both of them were united by an unshakable love for their city. I knew they could help me find my way to the Franciscan friary that was hosting me and some other out-of-town demonstrators. Cedric made sure we all knew he was hungry, and if he hadn't, I would have, so we split off towards the BP station and bought some beef jerky sticks to share. The store grew congested, so we made our way outside and leaned against the storefront windows, pressing our backs in tight so that we fit under the slight overhang, barely keeping our heads dry. I hadn't yet finished unwrapping the Slim Jim when the store owner became just the latest in a set of frantic gesturers and loud yellers that day to tell us to move along or he'd call the cops. I didn't want to see the cops until I was protected by the thousands of demonstrators I knew I'd see later in the night, so I followed Cedric and Rodney to join all the rest of the bus riders, waiting for a ride under the small carport-style car wash in the gas station parking lot. By this time, the rain was at a steady pour, and everyone correctly assumed that no one would be coming for a car wash. The latest in our ploys to steal our heads from the miserable weather actually worked for a while. Cedric, Rodney, and I agreed to share a cab, and as we waited, most everyone found their way to a ride to wherever their destinations were. There were 6 of us now. 2 white women, upper middle class and dressed in appearance, 1 more black man, myself, Cedric, and Rodney. The women chatted excitedly, retelling shared memories, while the other man paced by himself. I stayed quiet, lost in my own thoughts and plans and fears about the weekend. Then the cops came. This was the second time in my life someone called the cops on a group I was with, despite us doing exactly what they told us to do if we didn't want to hear from the police. The 2 white and serious-looking patrolmen walked up to Cedric, who was standing closest to them, and voiced loud enough for us all to hear that we needed to find somewhere else to stand because this was private property. Annoyed, we once again dragged our feet to the open air, unsure where to go, before we finally settled under what I recall as a mid-sized live oak tree, our heads pattered by every chilly drip that permeated the canopy. We mumbled quietly to ourselves and shared complaints with the other man who had now joined us. That's when I noticed that the 2 women were not with us. In fact, they were still standing under the car wash, completely undisturbed by the officers. Soon enough, the 4 of them, 2 in uniform, 2 in the top-of-the-line coats, were laughing it up, as if the officers had been welcome to join them and reminiscing about old times. My perspective shifted, and I imagined a black and white photograph capturing the moment. A landscape filled with the dark and dreary colors of an unseasonably cold early October downpour. 2 laughing white women having the grandest time chatting with 2 uniformed police officers under an overhang that kept them completely dry, while in the background 3 black bodies huddled together under a measly oak tree, sopping wet with perceptible discomfort on their faces. And then, of course, there was me, only with the 3 black men under the tree because I chose to be, but knowing full well that I could have probably been able to stand under the car wash yucking it up with the police officers just fine. This was my welcome to St. Louis. This was my very slight and watered-down introduction into what black life was like in occupied St. Louis in 2014. Exactly 50 years after segregation was formally ended in the United States, you couldn't tell the 2 eras apart except for the cars and the clothes. But that wasn't all. Though the cops left eventually, I still had some hard learning to do. We called 3 different cabs, and 3 times the cabs pulled up, glanced us over, or really glanced Cedric and Rodney over, rolled up their windows, put their cars in reverse, and drove away. After the last time, we just decided to leave that godforsaken property altogether and walk down the road in a general direction imperceptible to me. We literally stuck our thumbs out and started flagging down cars. Finally, we caught a ride from a black Muslim woman who normally was a cab driver but had just come back from picking up her daughter from school. My time in St. Louis wasn't all bad. There were many gracious and welcoming people I met after I arrived in the city of all races and backgrounds. She was the first. But the incidents at the gas station foreboded the many encounters I was to have with the power structures that weekend. For the first time in my life, I put myself in a position to feel just a fleeting fraction of the discrimination and oppression felt in Black America on a daily basis, especially in St. Louis, and especially in the suburb of Ferguson, my destination. I'm Ian Campbell, also known as Neighbor Democracy. Thanks for listening to episode 1, Who Are We? I wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the songs used in this episode. The first song that we introduced the episode with was Şehrîbana Kurdî's song Kîne, Who Are We? It's a famous Kurdish song that is a cover of Şivan Perwer's song of the same name, and asks the question, who are we as Kurdish people? In the interlude, we had Şivan Perwer's song Heval po Robeson, which is one of those real links between the Kurdish Freedom Movement and the Black Freedom Movement, and it was actually a song written about a black activist who was very famous in America for his labor activism, his songwriting, and his commitment to international solidarity, as well as being marked as an enemy of the state, a communist, through the House Un-American Activities Committee. Şivan Perwer recorded this song, which was actually originally a poem done by another Kurdish artist. And this was a direct tribute to Paul Robeson's work, and showed Şivan Perwer's appreciation and kind of the unity and the struggles that he saw between the Kurdish movement and the Black Freedom Movement. And then finally, we are closing out the episode now with I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown, which is kind of a similar exploration as is Kîne, talking about the identity of oneself as a people, specifically in this case in the Black Power movement in the late 1960s. James Brown is calling for Black people to be proud of themselves as Black people and to take what belongs to them. So these are just a few of the songs that we will really get into that show both kind of the immense Kurdish folk tradition and the Black music tradition that just really compounds the meaning and the sense of spirit and determination that has shaped these struggles throughout their history. So our next episode, episode 2, is called The End of Silence, and and gets into the period of the 1960s for both of these groups of people, as well as the major organizations that grow out of that time period, like the PKK for the Kurds, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Black Panther Party for African Americans. As of now, I'm conceiving this to be a 5-part series, and I have to do it in parts because otherwise it would be several hours long. Anyway, thank you for listening to this first episode, and stay tuned for the second.